Welcome, I hope you're enjoying Roots Tech, and this is Adventures of an Amateur Genetic Genealogist. So, I actually first started getting into genealogy, just traditional genealogy, in about 2005. Happened to, unsurprisingly, not coincidentally, it happened when a lot of sites started being online for doing a lot of genealogy. My family's genealogy had been done going very far back, but by having it be online, it was a lot easier to access. I just kind of got into it as a hobby. I nearly got into the genetic genealogy portion when I almost got a test. The cost of the test was still pretty expensive. This was back when DNA tests tended to go for $400 or more dollars. So it just wasn't really an option at the time. But, my wife knew that that was an interest to me, and so a few years down the road, when the costs of these tests had come down significantly, she gave it to me as an anniversary present. So it was a great surprise. I spit in the tube, sent off the test, and right after that, within a month of that anniversary, I finally finished school, graduated, and my parents took us on a vacation. On the drive, I got the health results back from the DNA test. I didn't have any ancestry results yet, but even just having the health results and reading through them, my dad was very fascinated to hear all of it. Part of the reason for the fascination was the fact that my dad was adopted. He didn't know who his biological parents were, and so having the DNA test thing come up, it really kind of reignited interest, and he kind of immediately ordered a test and sent it off. Him doing that test actually would later prove crucial in finding who his biological parents were. As I was starting to look at these matches and trying to figure out who was who, I started out with a very close match who I didn't recognize. I reached out to him, and he was adopted, and so he also didn't know who his biological family was. When my dad finally had his test results get processed, and they came back, we saw that he and this other guy shared the same mitochondrial DNA, were born within a couple of years of each other, and based on the amount of shared DNA, it was pretty clear they were half-brothers who shared the same mother. However, that didn't really help us in finding who my dad's biological parents were. My dad sent me all of the information he had, which amounted to one sheet that wasn't even fully filled out, and fairly sparse information. However, you really have to try to squeeze all you can out of minimal information for this type of work. It did mention that his biological mother had gone to Southern Utah University, so I reached out to them just to see what, if anything, they could do to help me out with this. But at the time, I didn't have a name, I didn't have an exact year, I knew roughly what her birth year was, but that was about it. So it didn't go too far, but they did point me to the fact that they had a lot of their yearbooks digitized and online, which was helpful. But, at that point in time, not super helpful yet. What ended up happening is eventually, as I reached out to these matches and tried to find out, what other matches do we share in common, and can I figure out how some of these people who all share DNA collectively with all of us as a group, can I find any of their common ancestors? Because that's probably going to be our common ancestor as well. That actually led me to feel fairly confident that I'd found one of my father's sets of great-grandparents, but I had no clue how he descended from them, and it was still quite a bit more work to do. Eventually, there was a match who also shared the same mitochondrial DNA, and who was likely a second cousin, maybe, third cousin, somewhere in that range. So because they had a tree, I was able to look and see who their mom's 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 mom was, and then look at all of her daughters, and then look at each of all of their daughters, and each of all of their daughters. And because I had an approximate birth year for my dad's birth mother, that let me narrow down that long list of all of the matrilineal descendants down to really just 6 women who descended matrilineally from this person and who would be about the right age. So with that list of 6 women, I went to the yearbooks. I just scoured them until I found one. I looked at the photo. It looked a lot like it could be a family member. I shared that information with my dad. We looked into it some more based on what we could kind of find about her online. It seemed like maybe things weren't lining up super well for her being my dad's birth mother. But I did point out that if it's not your birth mother, it's very possibly your aunt, or it's your mom's cousin. So it may be worth reaching out anyway. I got my dad her contact information, and he reached out. It turns out it was his aunt. She was able to tell him who his birth mother was. We looked up her contact information, and my dad was able to fulfill this sort of lifelong wish of being able to talk to his birth mother and thank her for the choice she made, which he was able to do. It turns out she didn't really want contact. It was a difficult topic, as is understandable. But his aunt did want to still talk, and through her we were able to find out a lot of information, including a big clue for who my dad's birth father was. She had at least a first name, which was Doug. And so with this new piece of information, I continued looking through the DNA matches, particularly finding ones where it looked like they likely came through my dad's dad. And I would send them all the information I had about what we knew about his dad to see if anyone had any clues. It ends up to some degree being a numbers game and a bit of luck of how likely it is that one of the people who's close enough to that person has also done a DNA test and is going to show up with this. However, we got lucky. Within 2 weeks of finding who my dad's biological mother was, we got a response from someone who said, "Hey, based on what you told me, I think it might be this guy." And he had a full list of all the descendants of some of his ancestors, and he pointed out who he thought it was. My dad and I started looking into it, and my dad came across a video article online about this person who we suspected might be his biological father. And the news article was about him being reunited with his son, and kind of showing that, and being able to see it, it was pretty clear immediately to me, yeah, this is my biological grandpa. I can see it. It looks like it's him. As I was doing all this, I was just keeping this big Excel sheet with all of my matches across all the different websites that I had stuff in. And, I work enough with Excel and a variety of applications that I know it well enough I was able to make it a fairly useful, robust tool. I didn't realize at the time that there were a few new tools then, and they're still around, and there's even more now, that can help you do a lot of the stuff I was doing in this Excel sheet. And in some cases better. The interface is always the big issue. And even with the Excel file, right, the interface can still be an issue. I have it for what it's worth. I was able to make it also be able to give a graphical representation of which segments of which chromosomes you got from which ancestor. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to email them a blank template. But again, the Excel sheet is also not necessarily the most user-friendly, so use it for what it's worth if you're interested. It did come in handy oftentimes with figuring out how you're related to different matches, especially as you begin to fill out and make connections and figure out which ancestors you're getting which chromosomes or which segments of which chromosomes from. It helps out a lot. So I found this new match, and all the DNA we shared, some of the segments I know I got from my paternal grandfather's dad, and some I got from my paternal grandfather's mom. So the fact that this new match shared DNA that seemingly came from both of my biological grandpa's parents, at first I was wondering, is this guy also a descendant of my biological grandpa? But given his family tree and some of the story, that didn't really line up. However, his grandpa was adopted, and based on the time frame, it actually perfectly lined up with my biological grandpa's younger brother, who we only had like his name, the year of his birth, and then no other information whatsoever. Anywhere we looked, there was just no records at all. And so, based on the story from him and the information we had, it all kind of harmonized, and we figured out that basically we'd found this long-lost younger brother, and that he had been adopted, and what his name was, and who his family was, and photos, and all this stuff. As a result, I ended up making this Facebook group to kind of have all the descendants of my biological great-grandpa be able to all come together, share information, stories. Upon doing that, not long thereafter, I found another match, Nicole, and as we looked through the segments, it seemed very likely that she also was a descendant of my biological grandpa. So we're half cousins, is what we determined. And hearing stories of her father and what they knew, it was great. Seeing photos was interesting because there's plenty of similarities there. And even finding stuff in terms of like what medications like caused different side effects or were more effective. Like there was a lot of very useful information. And frankly, this group has been a really nice, very pleasant thing where really about half the people in the group only know that they're part of this family due to the DNA testing. So we've really kind of like built this sort of family group together where we're able to share a lot of stuff. And it's been very nice. Now, that's not always how it plays out, right? In the realm of genetic genealogy. And in the course of helping out, dozens of friends' family find information in their biological family tree, I can share an example that was maybe not the happiest story. And actually, it also hits close to home. So my brother-in-law knew that I enjoyed doing this, and he sent me this email saying, like, hey, I know you like this. Maybe you can help us out. He had a DNA match. They knew they were close enough related that they should be able to find a match. But they just weren't finding a match anywhere. So I went ahead and started digging into it. I found that the other DNA matches that they shared in common with each other, many of them had trees, and all of them were all hitting kind of the same people as the common ancestors. And so I had to conclude that this couple is very, very likely in my wife's biological tree. Just not sure where her nominal family tree diverged from the biological tree. Digging into it some more and talking to my wife about it, she tossed out the idea that maybe her grandpa, maybe her dad's dad wasn't really biologically her grandpa. As I looked into stuff more, that lined up with a lot of stuff. I had found matches through 3 of her 4 grandparents, and the only one I hadn't was her dad's dad. So that lined up as well. Looking at that couple who I figured had to be in the tree, they only had 2 daughters. Each of those daughters were married twice and had kids with each of their husbands. So with those 4 men, I made family trees for each of those 4 men, looked at what all the surnames were, and then just started dredging through the lists of my wife's matches and looking through what surnames they had in their tree and then seeing how that actually mapped out in their tree. Eventually, I found several matches who were all coming from one of these 4 guys, and it came through multiple branches of this guy's tree. So then I felt fairly confident that they must have my wife's tree must descend through this particular couple. This couple only had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and boy, it seemed like that could be the right age to be my wife's biological grandpa. I searched around some more. I found a city directory that had his address the year before my father-in-law was born. And then I asked my wife, hey, what was your grandparents' address? She gave it to me. I punched them both into Google Maps, and they were next-door neighbors. So that kind of answered that question. This was not something that anyone who was still alive in the family knew anything about. Right? So this was kind of like some jarring information a bit for the family. But, in getting some photos of this guy, again, some uncanny similarities with my brother-in-law and him. So that was tough. That was a little tough for them to kind of grapple with and deal with. So it can be a mixed bag. You got to be careful. And I guess to wrap things up, things that I would list as being the most major lessons that I've learned from my adventures in doing genetic genealogy. There's a pattern to how people end up having their biological tree diverge from their nominal family tree. It's usually on the male side, generally because it's very easy to be not 100% sure who the father is. It's a lot more difficult to be unsure of who the mother is, just because of the nature of how biology works, right? Childbirth, it becomes pretty clear who the mom is. The other thing I'll say that I found is that often it tends to be the oldest kid who maybe is a surprise. There have been several instances where when I found how the connection takes place, that it's been, the oldest kid, and basically what it amounts to is the woman gets pregnant, she just tries to get married very quickly. And then she gets married, has the kid early, and life goes on. And that seemed to be just kind of how society decided to deal with it, 60, 70, 80 years ago. So societal norms have largely changed between then and now. I'm not entirely sure how much the actual human behavior changed in terms of just general drives and how often people were ended up making choices that resulted in children coming into the world. So that's been an interesting facet. The other thing that I'll mention is that there's, at least currently, there is definitely some significant white American privilege when it comes to how easy it is to make these kind of discoveries when you do a DNA test. I think that will change as time goes on. Just like in the 1990s, the probability of, someone being on the internet in some chat group somewhere, it skewed more towards white people in the U.S. at the time because they were the people with the financial means and ability to get access to it. I'm cautiously optimistic that as time rolls on, we'll see a similar thing to how now most of the world has access to the internet and can get online and do things. I'm hopeful that maybe as time goes on, access to the DNA tests will become easier and easier for people to be able to do, and that as you get more and more people in these databases, it'll become easier for people who aren't white from America to be able to find more and more and more matches. I offer that as a caution because as I've tried to help people, it is noticeable that depending on who you are, the number of possible matches that you have can oftentimes be dramatically less, and if it's low enough, you're not going to be able to find close enough connections to really meaningfully be able to get at these types of discoveries that are otherwise possible. Anyway, I hope you've learned some stuff from this. I hope it was enjoyable, and hopefully this can kind of maybe fuel some desire on your part to be able to see what you can learn about your tree using genetic genealogy, and maybe some tips and tricks to aid you in that process. I wish you the best of luck. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions or chat as I'm able and have time. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you.